President Trump has decided to waive the Iran sanctions as mandated by the 2015 nuclear deal, but is expected to impose new non-nuclear related sanctions on Tehran and top regime individuals for human rights abuses. The president is also under fire over alleged derogatory remarks against Haiti and Africa during a meeting on immigration. The president denies the remarks, but one Democratic senator insists he used racist language. German Chancellor Angela Merkel reaches preliminary agreements with Social Democrat rival Martin Schulz for a unity government, enabling her to avoid new elections and remain in power. And Mark Zuckerberg introduces a new news feed for Facebook, promising it will emphasize shared posts from family and friends instead of pushing paid ads on Facebook users. Welcome back to The Rundown. And as we just reported, word now coming out of the White House that despite calling the Iran deal the worst deal that was ever reached, U.S. President Donald Trump has decided to continue to waive the sanction, to maintain the waiver on the sanctions that were lifted as a result of the deal, in essence, keeping the nuclear Iran agreement in place, but at the same time imposing new sanctions on Iran and top regime individuals. This focused not on the nuclear program, but on human rights abuses. Well, let's go more into the implications of decision. We are joined here in the studio by Emily Landau, Director of the Arms Control and Regional Security Program at the INSS here in Israel. Good evening. And from Washington, we have Matthew RJ Brodsky, Middle East and geopolitical analyst. And let me start with you, Matthew. Your reaction, President Trump basically keeping the deal, but tweaking, you might say, the situation with Iran by imposing non-nuclear related sanctions.
Right, and I think that's the right move, and it was essentially expected at this point. There wasn't enough movement inside Congress and with the P5+1 countries that the U.S. negotiated with to make the deal originally with Iran. So I don't think that there were enough there was enough time to make fixes that would work. And what he's going to do is essentially kick the can down the road another 3 months until this deadline comes back up again. But in the meantime, start by imposing more sanctions on Iran, specifically outside of the agreement, so it doesn't affect the nuclear deal. But he has, for instance, tools at his disposal. For example, there's the law already on the U.S. books from 2012 where he can start sanctioning outside entities that are providing materials to Iran, and anything that is currently being used to suppress the protest movement there can be sanctioned under humanitarian grounds. He also has room for sanctioning on terrorism grounds. So he has a lot of tools still left to use. Okay.
Emily, your reaction to the White House move, and I want you to pick up on Matthew's point. Is he right that imposing new sanctions will have no bearing on how the Iranians view their compliance with the nuclear deal?
Well, it depends on interpretation, but I think the sanctions that will be imposed will be carefully crafted so that they do not impinge upon those sanctions that are written into the Iran nuclear deal, because the idea is not to do something at this point that would spell ending U.S. participation in the deal. I think it's really important, though, to understand, as we're trying to understand the entire episode now with the Trump administration and in light of the policy that was declared October 13th, the timeline for the sanction waivers is a timeline that was set way before Trump became president. And therefore, there's no connection between that and decisions that need to be made by this administration in line with their policy. And therefore, it doesn't make sense to take an arbitrary timeline as far as Trump-Iran policy is concerned and make that dictate, whether the Trump administration right now in mid-January will leave the deal. So I think at this point in time, where the administration has not yet geared up for all of the things that they would like to do in terms of pushing back on Iran, ramping up the pressure, strengthening the deal itself. There are a lot of things that can be done per the deal itself, increasing transparency, other things. So that timeline needs to be left alone and not connected to the waivers timeline. And I think that's why we see, even though the president views this deal as a highly problematic deal, it's not now the right time to take action that would mean the U.S. leaving the deal. There are things that still need to be done. There are policies that still need to be put into place in terms of sanctions, in terms of re-examining the deal, and that process needs to come to some kind of fruition before a decision would be made whether the United States or the Trump administration actually wants to exit the deal.
Well, let me ask you, Matthew, because you said this is the right move for now. The Trump administration making these sanctions but by staying in the deal, they are basically admitting that Iran is in compliance with this deal on its nuclear program. It doesn't look like the worst deal ever to me. It looks like maybe a flawed deal, but not a bad deal. Should the U.S. just stick with this deal and then operate outside of it with, for example, additional sanctions and measures?
Well, technically, they're not saying that Iran is complying with the deal. What they're saying is, of the 4 conditions that were laid out by the U.S. Congress, that they're basically still not meeting some of those conditions, which have to do with, on one hand, is it still in the United States' interest, which it is not in the long term. But beyond that, the fact is, we need to understand that the U.S. and the U.S. just doesn't have any leverage right now. The Obama administration parted with all of that beforehand. So to argue that we should just have this open-ended and not have the timelines coincide. I mean, yes, it was the U.S. Congress that put together every 3 months that this issue would come to the fore. The Trump administration is anxious not to have every 3 months this issue with a giant spotlight on it, because it creates exactly this type of dialogue. Well, is he saying that Iran is compliant or not? But in the meantime, since Iran has already received all of the financial benefits up front, and all they need to do is wait until they can get to a breakout period and the sunset clauses happen, the only leverage the U.S. can try to reestablish is the fact that it won't stay in the deal. So it needs to apply pressure to
Matthew,
Europe.
I just want to ask Emily, though. Emily, do you think the Iranians would sit still for trying to, in a sense, renegotiate a deal that they signed with the Obama administration?
I don't think they're going to try to renegotiate the deal. I think they're going to try to strengthen the deal, and there's a difference. There are things, there's ambiguities.
I'm not sure that Iran is going to see the difference.
Well, Iran can see what Iran wants to see. I think the United States needs to lead policy in accordance with U.S. national security interests. I think that's what the Trump administration has signaled, and I think they're going to try to move forward in a manner with, hopefully, with allies from Europe, even though right now they don't seem to be interested in going along with the Trump administration's policy direction. But I think the United States has to make this effort. The Trump administration has to make this effort, again, not to renegotiate the deal, strengthen the deal, and those aspects that can be strengthened through pressure, ramping up the sanctions. Pressure has always been a key with Iran. When Iran is pressured, the only reason they came to the table in 2013 was because of the pressure of the biting sanctions. That was relinquished in the negotiations. There's a need to build up that pressure again on Iran.
Since you raised one problem with that, let me ask you, can that be done without European cooperation? And
well,
now they're not cooperating.
I think even the president said that in October. He's going to need cooperation from allies, and that's why he put the threat on the table. If he doesn't get that cooperation, if he's not able to move forward on those aspects of the deal and sanctions, with regard to missiles, I mean, as was said, there's a whole list of things.
The breakout period.
If he doesn't get that cooperation, he might have no choice but to leave the deal. The deal is a really problematic deal, and that's the way the administration is viewing this issue.
Okay. Dr. Emily Landau, Matthew Brodsky there in Washington, thanks for joining us. And stick with us, because we're going to be going back to Washington to get more details on this dramatic announcement out of the White House that they are going to maintain the Iran deal for now, but imposing new sanctions on the regime and individuals. So lots more to come. Stay with us.